Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to keep Series 9 and Week 74 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, last week we continued letter 214, where we learned that our tradition of wedding gifts would horrify hobbits. Today, we visit some of those further vistas the professor said open up when information is given. Specifically, as he writes, more anthropological matters implicit to such terms as kinship, family, clan, and so on. Not only will he explore these matters, but just in case Mr. Nunn is inclined to inquire further about Smeagol's grandmother, whom Gandalf represents as a ruler of a family of high repute, large and wealthier than most, and even calls a matriarch, Tolkien's going to add a note about that too. Like I said 2 weeks ago, you cannot out-pedant the professor. He begins by making a claim about hobbits that we know is also true of elves, that they were, quote, universally monogamous. In fact, he says they didn't often remarry even if their spouse died young. Additionally, he points out that their family arrangements were patrilinear rather than patriarchal. That is, their family names descended in the male line, and women were adopted into their husband's name. Also, the titular head of the family was usually the eldest male. For the powerful families, the Tooks are the example he mentions, families that are more like clans than what we imagine a family to be, the head was properly the eldest male of what was considered the most direct line of descent. But a nominal head didn't rule the household on his own. Tolkien writes that the Shire household was not a monarchy, except by accident. It was a diarchy, in which master and mistress had equal status, if different functions. Either was held to be the proper representative of the other in the case of absence, including death. There were no dowagers. If the master died first, his place was taken by his wife, and this included, if he had held that position, the titular headship of a large family or clan. This title thus did not descend to the son or other heir while she lived, unless she voluntarily resigned. Therefore, since it was possible for the male head of a family to die relatively young, and his wife likely not to remarry, Tolkien says that a long-lived woman of forceful character could, under certain circumstances, remain the head of a family for quite some time. And as an example of this, he points to Laura Baggins, née Grubb, who remained head of the family of Baggins of Hobbiton until she was 102. As she was 7 years younger than her husband, who died at the age of 93 in Shire year 1300, she held this position for 16 years until Shire year 1316, and her son, Bungo, did not become head until he was 70, 10 years before he died at the early age of 80. Bilbo did not succeed until the death of his Took mother, Belladonna, in 1334, when he was 44. Now, you might recall from the story, though, that the headship of the Baggins family was a source of controversy. Tolkien explains that Otho Sackville Baggins was heir to this title, quite apart from questions of property that would have arisen if his cousin Bilbo had died intestate. But after the legal fiasco of 1342, when Bilbo returned alive after being presumed dead, no one dared to presume his death again. He then recaps the timeline. Otho died in 1412. His son Lotho was murdered in 1419, and his wife Lobelia died in 1420. When Master Samwise reported the departure over sea of Bilbo and Frodo in 1421, it was still held impossible to presume death. This led Sam, once he was mayor, to draft a rule, and frankly, very lawyerly of Tolkien to write it out in detail, which I won't repeat here or I won't be able to finish the letter this week. It just suffices to say that if a hobbit of the Shire passes over the sea, he or she is deemed to have relinquished all titles, rights, or properties, and the heirs get them right away. He then also recalls a morbidly funny story that I always remember in the back of my mind, but can never recall the details or where to find it. And this is where it is. This is why I can't find it in any of the actual appendices or histories of Middle-earth or anything like that. It's in the letters. And here we go. A well-known case also was that of Lalia the Great, or less courteously, the Fat. Fortinbras II, one-time head of the Tooks and Thane, married Lalia of the Clayhangers in 1314, when he was 36 and she was 31. He died in 1380 at the age of 102, but she long outlived him, coming to an unfortunate end in 1402 at the age of 119. So she ruled the Tooks and the Great Smiles for 22 years, a great and memorable, if not universally beloved, matriarch. She was not at the famous party, Shire year 1401, but was prevented from attending rather by her great size and immobility than by her age. Her son, Ferimbras, had no wife, being unable, it was alleged, to find anyone willing to occupy apartments in the Great Smiles under the rule of Lalia. Lalia, in her last and fattest years, had the custom of being wheeled to the great door to take the air on a fine morning. In the spring of Shire year 1402, her clumsy attendant let the heavy chair run over the threshold and tipped Lalia down the flight of steps into the garden. So ended a reign and life that might well have rivaled that of the great Took. Sorry, while I get that laughter out of the way before I continue with what he reveals in this letter. It was widely rumored that the attendant was Pearl, Pippin's sister, though the Tooks tried to keep the matter within the family. At the celebration of Ferimbras's accession, the displeasure and regret of the family was formally expressed by the exclusion of Pearl from the ceremony and feast. But it did not escape notice that later, after a decent interval, she appeared in a splendid necklace of her name jewels, that is, a pearl necklace, that had long lain in the hoard of the Thanes. Sounds a little shady to me, Pip. Might want to keep an eye on your sister. In another odd little story, Tolkien explains that in cases where the head died without a son, some families, like the Tooks, since their headship was connected with the office of Thane, sort of a military leadership, they would then determine headship through descent strictly through the male line. But other families might pass through a daughter to the heir's eldest grandson, regardless of the daughter's age. When that happened, the heir would take the name of his mother's family, retaining his father's family name as well. Tolkien says that this was the case with Otho Sackville Baggins. For the nominal headship of the Sackvilles had come to him through his mother, Camelia. It was his rather absurd ambition to achieve the rare distinction of being head of two families. He would probably then have called himself Baggins Sackville Baggins. Yes, he probably would have. Now, with all of this as background, Tolkien writes that there is no evidence that the stewards of Wilderland had come up with a matriarchal system. Instead, Gandalf's use, or rather his reporter and translator's use of the word matriarch, was not anthropological, but meant simply a woman who in fact ruled the clan. No doubt because she had outlived her husband and was a woman of dominant character. More than that, Tolkien writes, it is not, I think, to be supposed that any fundamental change in their marriage customs had taken place, or any sort of matriarchal or polyandrous society developed, even though this might explain the absence of any reference whatever to Smeagol Gollum's father. Tolkien continues, monogamy was at this period in the West universally practiced, and other systems were regarded with repugnance as things only done under the shadow. He ends the letter with some personal notes, telling Mr. Nunn that he'd started the letter 4 months prior, but never finished it. In the interim, Edith, who had been sick for much of the year, had been injured. Tolkien explains that she celebrated the return of health by a fall in the garden, smashing up her left arm so badly that she is still crippled and in plaster. The draft ends shortly thereafter, and this magnificent letter was never sent. And folks, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next series to see what I will talk about on Series 10's Tolkien Tuesdays. Speaking of which, you can be a part of deciding what that will be. Just visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council. You also can support the show, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. And please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. Podcast listeners, please be sure to subscribe to the TTT in your podcast apps. For those of you on YouTube, subscribe to this channel to get all the PPP productions, including, eventually, every episode of the PPP, both seasons of the Rings of Power wrap-up, all of this show, and my new streaming project, The PPP Plays. And be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and simply the Prancing Pony Podcast on Facebook. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.